It's November 4th, and today is the anniversary of my mum's death. She died from Alzheimer's 4 years ago. And so I'm going to talk about the life-affirming issue of death. And the first thing I want to say is that nobody alive, nobody, not you, not me, not your pastor, not your imam, not anybody alive knows what happens after death, right? We have to accept that. And anybody who tells you that they do know what happens after death is somebody to be extremely wary of, because usually they have an agenda that has to do with how you should live. And that's part of what I want to talk about today. So any opinion, any belief I express about what happens at death and what death means is just an opinion. It's just a belief. Like everyone else, I have absolutely no proof. And I think that that's very, very important, because I, like everybody else who talks about death, will try and persuade you to consider death only in as much as it informs how you live. That's what's important. That's what we know. That's what we're aware of. We're aware of life, of being alive. We are, at the very least, the universe experiencing itself. We are conscious. And one of the elements of consciousness is our consciousness of our mortality, our knowledge that we will die, the absolute certainty of that, except amongst the deluded who think they won't. So the question really is, what is death? What does it mean? What happens after death? And that's really what I'm going to talk about. Firstly, in the context of my mother and what she and we as a family went through with her Alzheimer's, but also about the generality of it, the fact that every single one of us will die, and how does that inform how we live? So the first question I want to address is, when did my mother die? And that may seem like a stupid question, but it's important, because today is the anniversary of the day that her heart stopped beating, that there were no signs of consciousness in her. But at least 2 years earlier, our mother was lost to us because she couldn't remember who we were or how we related to her, including my dad, to whom she had been married for over 62 years. And I know that this is a philosophical question relating to what it means to be alive. But the fact is that so much of who my mother was, as with all of us, was tied up in her identity as a wife, mother, florist, friend, how she related to other people. So when she reached the point when she no longer had any concept of her relationship to these people, including us, was she alive? And it's also a matter of how we perceived that as her husband, father, children, and so on. But she was in many ways alive. She was having a great time. She was laughing. She was in a good mood. She was happy. She was functioning as a human being, but she had no memory of who she was and how she related to other people. So the question then for me became, who is she dead to? And that was clearly to me, because I remember particularly in those final weeks when she would turn to me frequently and say, "And who are you? And do you have children?" and ask all of these questions, which tugged at my heart and made me believe that my mother was long gone. Long before she died, she was dead to me in that sense, which was tragic, because there she was in front of me, very much functioning as a human being. And I know that this is even more terrible for my dad, who sat with her every day, with her having no clear idea of who he was. Nothing more than the feeling that he was somebody important and benevolent to her. So that was a really interesting time for philosophical reflection on the nature of death. And as I'm sure many of you will appreciate, her actual death on the 4th of November 2018 came as a relief to most of us, because we didn't necessarily have to mourn to the extent that a sudden death causes, because, as I say, she was already dead. And that gave rise to a lot of reflection in me about the nature of death. And as I said, I have come to certain conclusions about that, but the principal one is that it doesn't matter except in as much as it informs how you live. And that's what I want to talk about now. So, as many of you already know, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in an interventionist being of any sort. I don't believe that there's anybody out there responding to prayers and all of those things, right? And I've explained in other videos how that came about, why I believe what I believe. But in a sense, it doesn't matter because, as I said earlier, what is important is how those beliefs inform how I live and relate, particularly to other people, but to the world in general, how I treat the world and the people in it. Because ultimately, what I believe in isolation, if I was a hermit in a cave, it wouldn't affect anyone. It wouldn't mean anything. It would simply be a personal world inside my head. But whatever I believe about the nature of life, relationships, and everything does affect how I relate to people. And death is such a core element of that, our beliefs about death. Because, for example, if you believe that there is life after death, and particularly if you believe that that life is one of what we commonly call heaven, some kind of nirvana, some kind of reward, some kind of better life than the one that we encounter on earth, then it is quite possible, and this happens very frequently, that we become allied to our death because it is an area of hope, which means that sometimes we act as most monotheistic modern religions teach, are death cults, because they promise a life that is better than the one here, based on how we act, which then reinforces how we behave towards people. And as you know, in practice, what this means is very often bigotry and resistance to other people and other beliefs, rather than what is generally commanded in the books relied on to foster these beliefs: love, compassion, charity. And I know those two exist, but for many, many people, the promise of heaven means that they welcome and in many ways pursue death. And we see this particularly amongst evangelical Christians and radical Islamists, is that they commit acts of terror or bigotry in pursuit of their reward in heaven. And whether that's 70 virgins or playing a harp at the right hand of God or communing with Jesus or whatever you believe, it informs what you do. And my experience, and I think most people's experience, is that that actually informs bad ways of being in the world that cause division instead of unity and love, that cause diversity to become an issue of concern and problem rather than one to be embraced as one of the beautiful joys of life. And so I am against religion for a million reasons, but that is one of the strong ones, because they make death attractive and reinforce that by the promise of hell or punishment, so that people start to live for death. And that really means that you're not living at all, because it forces you to be in the future instead of in the present, which, as we know from a purely philosophical point of view, is all we have. We only know this minute. We can't go back to the past, and we have no idea what's going to happen in the future, like none. And we want control over that. We fear the consequences of death. And so somebody giving us a comforting answer helps us deal with our mortality, but it doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it true. And so I'm often asked as an atheist, well, what about death? Don't you fear that? If you think all there is this, then doesn't that cloak you in fear and trepidation and pointlessness? Doesn't that give rise to nihilism? And I say, yes, for some people it does, but for me it doesn't. For me, it makes me want to grasp this tiny fragment of time that we're given of being conscious and aware, and absolutely make the most of it, to live to the fullest extent, to learn to love, to just embrace everything that this blip of time offers us. because we have absolutely no idea what happens afterwards. And to live for what we have no idea about is literally pointless. It's nihilistic to believe in something that happens after the one thing we know is true, which is that we are alive and have this opportunity to embrace the wonders of being alive. And that can include pain, suffering, as well as pleasure and ease, which we pursue. And to that extent, I think Buddhist philosophy comes closest to reflecting how we should live. And again, that's my personal belief. I have no knowing, except that I do know that it makes a difference in this life, in this world, when we relate with love and compassion towards other people and the world. We know that that has good outcomes for those other people and the world. However, if we act with prejudice and bigotry and fear towards other people and the world, or we exploit other people or the world in pursuit of our selfish needs, we know that the outcome as a general proposition for other people and the world is bad. We know, for example, and to me it's extremely strange, that continuing to rely on fossil fuels, for example, or burning the rainforest, or polluting, or reducing biodiversity, we know that those have bad consequences, right? And the only way we can possibly justify that, in my view, is to say, well, we're all going to die anyway, so fuck it, let's see, the universe is going to burn out in X billion years' time. We think we know that. And so we behave in a way that we know is detrimental, and that is often driven by the promise of the better life after death that nobody can promise or know anything about. And to me, that's a real paradox of human existence. And so, yes, my atheism actually informs how I live, because I don't tie myself to something I have no knowledge of. And I assume that the end of consciousness, death, is the end of my knowledge of this existence. That yes, it may well be that my consciousness goes somewhere else, manifests in a different way, but I'm pretty certain that it doesn't manifest as me, right, in just some other plane. But it doesn't matter, and that's my whole point. It really doesn't matter. And so I wanted to conclude with the issue of the fear of death and mourning. And to say that as an intellectual exercise, I don't fear death at all. And in the words of Elvi and the singer Matt Berninger of The National, I'm not afraid to die, I just don't want it to hurt. And I'm very much in that school. But I also have a kind of more unconscious, somewhat visceral reaction to the thought of death. Of course, there's a little bit of fear there. I can intellectualize that till the cows come home. But nevertheless, there's still this subconscious element of fear. But I suppress that very consciously, very deliberately, very intentionally, because I don't know. And fearing what you don't know is just as bad as hoping for what you don't know, of living in the hope of heaven or living in the belief of heaven is just as damaging as living in the fear of hell for all those reasons, or fear of the unknown, which is what assails most of us, particularly non-religious people who cling to whatever doctrine the church or your religious circles teach. It's the not knowing, the fear of the unknown, which is extremely visceral. I think it's rooted in our mortality, and then filters down from our mortality to all aspects of life. Fear of strangers, fear of strange places, fear of strange dangers, and all of these things. It's an instinct within us that actually serves us because it kept us alive for centuries. But we extend it outwards in a modern world where many of our fears are not actually justified, but they still are embodied in us. And death is the greatest of those, right? And so if we live in fear, then of course we do ourselves and the world and our fellow man no good at all. So I choose to ignore that fear and live in the present as much as I am capable of, because I know, as opposed to believe, that this is all there is right now. This is the only thing we have. And so to that extent, any fear of death that I have is something that I choose to put aside in favor of living now. And so I wanted to conclude this by saying that I would urge you, instead of worrying about death, instead of spending time contemplating death, contemplate living. Contemplate how you turn up in the world with respect to other people and the planet and the environment and your consumerism and your way of dealing with issues like immigration, diversity, misogyny, racism, and all of these things, because these are what affect people's lives right now. And if there is any justice in life, whether religious or otherwise, then behaving well towards people, behaving with love and compassion, has to have a better outcome than acting with fear and greed and bigotry towards other people. Otherwise, there is no justice. And that's, of course, a possibility too. And certainly as an atheist, I don't believe that there's a judging God. But what I do believe is that we live in a universe governed by its own rules. And the more we align with those rules, and it doesn't matter where they came from, how they arose, but they are there, the laws of the universe. If we align with them, if we are in harmony with the laws of the universe, then generally things will go well for us. However, if we're out of harmony, and we know what is out of harmony with the universe, hatred, fear, bigotry, and we know that because of how it makes us feel inside when we act that way. We know when we're being selfish and bigoted and acting from fear. And we also know that when we act from love and compassion and empathy, it makes us feel good. That's our best indicator of what is right and wrong, how that arises in our soul, in our heart. Okay? And again, I'm not saying I believe that we have a soul, but I know that I have soul because I feel it. Okay? And so do you. The minute that you slow down from your life, living in a nostalgia of the past or some hope of the future, you know what's true now. So what I'm going to urge you to do is, as often as possible, make yourself present by asking yourself this question: what am I aware of? And examining what can you touch, taste, see, smell, hear, what emotions are arising in you as a result. If you ask that question all the time, it means that you bring yourself to the present, because you have to consider what you are touching, tasting, smelling, hearing, seeing right now, and what you are feeling. And that mindfulness, that presence, means that you will appreciate those seconds of life. And as I've said, I believe that's literally all we have. That's all we have. The rest is unknowable and therefore not worth knowing, except, or believing, except in as much as it helps you live now and hopefully helps you live well. Much love to all of you.